Hello, it's really good to be with you from all over Christ Central today. I'm very sorry that it's not face-to-face. I do love getting together and seeing friends from all over the region, but sadly we can't do that. And so here we are praying together, but I'm so glad we're praying together with the help of online technology and Zoom. So thanks for joining us. And the team have asked me to talk a little bit about the coronavirus crisis in the context of our care for the people on the margins of society, the poor, the vulnerable at this time. So let me just wind the clock back to the end of last year, first of all. In November, our Jubilee Plus team was in Bristol for our last conference, and we published a booklet in November last year called A Deepening Crisis. I've got a copy of it here. And you can access this online, jubilee-plus.org. There's a PDF there. A Deepening Crisis has a subtitle, Preparing Your Church for Increasing Poverty in Our Communities. And we start by writing, we're living in difficult times for many. And as this book outlines, we believe life may get harder for those in poverty in our nation over the coming years. That was last November, long before anyone had heard of the coronavirus and long before this pandemic had broken out in the UK. Why did we write a booklet which has a seemingly pessimistic view of poverty and need in our country? For this very specific reason. Some years ago, Ginny Bergin, who I think you'll all know, from Sheffield, spoke prophetically to our Jubilee Plus team and to others in other contexts, and described the situation in our nation emerging in the current years by mentioning the story of Joseph in the Old Testament as a paradigm, a way of thinking about what was going to happen in the UK. And with Joseph, of course, there were 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of hardship and shortage and famine. And she said to us all those years ago, as a team at Jubilee Plus and to others, but particularly to us, that we should consider that our nation, the UK, is in a situation where now we are in the years of plenty, even though there was hardship around in those years. And that the situation is going to change for the worse socially and economically in years to come, and that we should be preparing the church for those more difficult times. Now, that was a sobering word, and we've lived with this Joseph prophetic picture for a number of years and spoken about it publicly, several times publicly. I've mentioned that we have this anticipation and that we feel that we need to prepare. My colleague Natalie Williams has done so also in other talks she's given around the country. And we wrote this booklet, A Deepening Crisis, with that in mind. So when the coronavirus came to the UK in February and then in early March, as things began to really accelerate and get really serious in this country, and people started making radical changes and everything had to change very suddenly, at that time, I thought to myself, in my heart, I just knew this is the time. It was a sobering moment, but I was energized because I felt God is preparing us for this. Now, we had no idea, and I had no idea where the source of this difficulty may come. I had no idea about this virus coming over from China. But when it came, I felt that we are moving into these years in this country, which will be the years of hardship, the years of difficulty, the years we've been asked to prepare for. Now, that's one prophetic perspective I want to bring to you today as we prepare to pray. But here's a second perspective. So as I began to pray during March, when the crisis was really gaining momentum and lockdown started, I thought very deeply and came across in my Bible reading the feeding of the 5,000. And I looked in Mark's account And I remembered the difficulty the disciples faced with this huge crowd. They were tired. They were away from home. You know the story well. And Jesus said to them one very simple thing. He said, you give them something to eat. And in that passage and in that thought is a seed of faith. Even though we are going through hard times in our country, I believe that the church has the capacity through God's provision and connected with our own faith to do amazing things. And that's what I want to really bring to you today. But you'll immediately say to me, people are losing their jobs in our churches, our budgets are being cut. People are on furlough on our staff teams. We can't foresee the future. Our buildings can no longer be used for public meetings and for renting out to other people and all these other problems. Now, I know about all those problems. We've got similar problems in our own church too. But I feel that despite all those things, if we keep a priority for the marginalized and the unemployed and the people in need in our communities, God will bring an amazing multiplication to us. So those are two prophetic words which I hope can shape your thinking at this time. The Joseph paradigm, we are entering into hard times, no doubt about it, and this is going to last for years. The economic consequences are serious. But also, God speaking to us and saying prophetically that he can do miracles and multiply resources and bless us as we still keep a priority for the people on the margins, the people we can help who are really, really vulnerable at this time. Now, let me just put a few practicalities to you. Some things to think about and engage with at this time. Some of these are obvious. Some of these are things you're doing already, no doubt. But if you're engaged with the food bank, here's a good starting point. Food banks are vital at this time. They're going to be needed more and more. And secondly, and this is something that I want to just introduce into the conversation here, food banks are about emergency support, but I believe we could be entering into a phase in our country where food banks become a platform for a range of services to the community, life skills, particularly job readiness, job clubs, debt advice, all those kind of things that are going to be very, very strategic in years to come. Food banks are a platform for other things to be built on. That's begun a little bit in our country. My prediction is that that's going to develop as a major theme. We're going to build on the platform of food banks many other things, and we're going to need to do that in years to come. That's the first thing just to bring to your attention as a specific issue. The second one is this. In this crisis, telephone support for the vulnerable and isolated has been an idea that has gained big traction in the church across the country. Individual churches like mine, Barnabas in Shrewsbury, we've set up a little telephone support service for some of our vulnerable clients in our social projects. Some national charities like Linking Lives, that's linkinglives.uk, which is a partner charity of Jubilee Plus, they're setting up a free phone-based telephone support service. So whilst there's social isolation, and that could go on for a long time, and many people shaken by this crisis, telephone support of vulnerable people is something that we will see developing. And if you're interested in that and want to talk a bit further about that, you can just email to admin@jubilee-plus.org, and we'll talk to you about the things that we are aware of and know in that area. That's the second thing. Food banks developing with platforms of life skills, number one. Number two, telephone support, I think is going to grow and develop. Thirdly, there's an opportunity now at this very particular time for us to engage in our local communities with the key service providers who are under such incredible pressure, housing associations, local authorities, the police, all the different services that are dealing with all the complexities, let alone the medical services that are faced through the coronavirus crisis and some of the social outworkings. People are more open for conversation now than at any time that I've known. That applies in my own local community, but I've heard stories up and down the country. Now is the time to engage, or engage more deeply, and work with and encourage people who are tremendously hard-pressed to cope with the pressures that they are faced with. The fourth thing I just want to bring to your attention is concerning the local media. If you have the capacity in your church to engage with the media, it's a good time to do so, to bring good news stories, to give the message that the church is a place of hope, to tell stories about the things you're doing for people in need, notably food banks and other services that you're able to still provide. It's good to get a good media narrative at this time. The fifth thing I want to mention is undoubtedly we're entering into a time of new and unexpected gospel opportunities. People have been shaken. Our commitment in our Western culture to health and wealth and personal security is being shaken to the core. People have lost so much already, and there's much more that's going to be lost in the months to come. There's a sense of openness to the gospel. I was just speaking to a member of our church today talking about their family members who are more open than ever before, having long telephone conversations about faith that they'd never been willing to have before. I'm talking to people who are starting and developing online alphas and equivalent online outreach. And I think the online alpha methodology is something that's just going to grow and grow at this time and provides many different opportunities. So we should expect that people will be coming to Christ, and really praying for that as this crisis unfolds. Because as God shakes, so one of his purposes is always to bring people to faith in him. I was talking to a pastor recently who told me of a guy in an inner city area who had been preached to before. He'd heard about Christ. He'd rejected the message in a rather mocking way. He then contracted COVID-19 and contacted this pastor and said, "You never guess what? I've given my life to Christ. I want to say sorry for all the things that I've said before, and I want to follow him." These things are going to happen much more as time goes on. And then, of course, in conclusion, for my sort of issues to engage with, I want to talk a little bit about people who are in our church who are key influencers and key players in this time. There'll be people in your church who are really strategic, whether they're care workers, nurses, medics, working in local authority, working in public policy, medical policy, all sorts of different areas. We really need to support and pray for those people. In Jubilee Plus, one of our colleagues who helps us very close to our team, Professor Keith Brown from Bournemouth University, who heads up the social work post-qualification training for the whole of the UK. He's a government advisor working directly with the top advisors now in terms of medical and nursing policy, and we're praying for him as a friend. You'll have people in your churches who will be influential in your locality and in your community, and we really do want to keep praying for them. What about the longer term? Two things to say about the longer term. One is, as an international movement, Christ Central Churches, we need to think about the situation in all the different countries that we are involved with. And I'm not going to try and list them all, but there are a variety of countries in Africa. Of course, we have Canada, we have Mexico, we have friends in Ukraine who are joining in, and churches in other parts of the world as well, and in Sweden, and the list goes on. Now, in the countries in the developing world in particular, in Africa and Mexico and places like that we're connected with, will be experiencing, and you may be aware of this already, tremendous changes going on in their communities, because the coronavirus pandemic will have a far more severe effect in the developing world than it'll have in the UK or in Western nations. It's pretty bad here, but it's going to be devastating in many developing countries because the infrastructure and capacity to respond to this threat is not established and fully functional. So we need to be very aware of that. And our partnerships internationally involving finance and sharing of resources are going to be very important at this time as we consider our friends in other nations in the Christ Central Partnership. I'm sure Jeremy may talk about this in another message, but I'm mentioning it here because it's directly connected to the social justice priorities of our churches. We in our church in Shrewsbury and in our network, we've been raising funds for our friends in Ukraine and who are joining Christ Central just at this time, and their country's going through tremendous difficulties as a relatively poor European country. There are plenty of other examples. So that's one longer term perspective to think about. The second one in the UK is that we really must anticipate significant rise in unemployment as 2020 comes to the end and then into next year. This will have massive implications economically, put a lot of people in very vulnerable positions, and you can understand the implications of that. And we need to be ready to support those people that we know, support them through food banks, support them through life skills and other opportunities that we have to help them, support them through money advice, debt advice, wherever we can. There's going to be a massive rise in unemployment, and that's going to put huge pressure on our country. The church really needs to be on the front foot. So I hope this is helpful to you. This is a briefing from the point of view of the Jubilee Plus team with a social justice perspective on the coronavirus crisis. There are many other important issues in the crisis which I haven't mentioned. I've just focused on the things that I've been asked to speak about in this context. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to connect with what Jubilee Plus is up to, a way you can do that is by connecting with our weekly Zoom updates and briefings for activists and church leaders, jubilee-plus.org. And weekly you can connect to us through that method. Now, we're going to pray now. And as we pray, I'm proposing that you focus on food banks, number one. Number two, on governments, our own UK governments and the other governments of the different countries represented in the Christ Central Partnership, as their decisions are crucial. And also, thirdly, for our church response to people in need, just to pray that our church members are able to reach out, to support, to finance, to volunteer, to help people in need as far as they are able to do, bearing in mind some people are not free to move around in the context of lockdown. So 3 points to pray for. Thanks for listening in, and let's pray together right now.